Ma'am, where are your citizenship documents? The real ones, not just a driver's license.
Excuse me, who asked for those?
People like you always seem suspicious. Let me see proof of citizenship.
It was 9:47 a.m. on a Thursday when security cameras at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport captured something that would shock the nation and destroy careers. A 52-year-old black woman wearing elegant casual clothes was passing through the TSA security checkpoint area when she was approached by 3 ICE agents in full tactical uniforms. They surrounded her, blocking her path, demanding she prove she had a right to be in the country. The woman tried to calmly explain she was an American citizen, that she was just traveling for work, that this was a mistake. The agents laughed. One of them made a comment about how they all say that. Another suggested maybe she should have thought about her choices before entering illegally. What these agents didn't know, what their arrogance and prejudice prevented them from discovering, is that the woman they were intimidating was Federal Judge Evelyn Morrison, one of the most respected magistrates of the Seventh Circuit, presidentially appointed, with authority over federal cases in 3 states. And everything that happened in the next 25 minutes was captured on crystal clear video from multiple angles, creating evidence that would not only end these agents' careers, but trigger a federal investigation into ICE practices at airports across the country. Before we dive into this absolutely insane story, tell me something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, hit that subscribe button because stories like this can't be forgotten. They need to be documented. They need to be shared. You won't want to miss a single second of what happens next. This is one of those stories that proves no matter how high you climb, no matter how much you achieve, for some people your skin will always be reason enough to doubt you. Judge Evelyn Morrison wasn't just any federal judge. She was one of the most brilliant legal minds of her generation. Daughter of migrant workers who had come from Alabama to Chicago during the Great Migration of the 1960s, Evelyn grew up on the South Side watching her parents work 3 jobs each so she could have opportunities they never had. She graduated with highest honors from the University of Chicago, then from Yale Law School, where she was an editor of the Yale Law Journal. She worked as a law clerk for a Supreme Court justice, practiced civil rights law for 15 years, representing the forgotten and marginalized, and then was appointed to the federal bench at 44, becoming one of the youngest black federal judges in the country. In the 8 years since her appointment, she had written opinions considered landmarks in cases of civil rights, immigration rights, and constitutional freedoms. She was known for her sharp mind, her elegant writing, and her absolute refusal to tolerate injustice in her courtroom. On that Thursday morning, Evelyn was returning from a judicial conference in Washington, D.C., where she had been keynote speaker on criminal justice reform. She was wearing gray casual pants, a blue silk blouse, and a light blazer, carrying a small carry-on suitcase and her work briefcase. She wasn't wearing any judicial insignia or official identification because she was traveling as a civilian. Her flight had just landed. She passed through customs normally, collected her baggage, and was walking toward the exit when she was approached. The 3 ICE agents, who would later be identified as Derek Hansen, Miguel Cruz, and Jennifer Walsh, were stationed near the security area, conducting what they later claimed were random immigration compliance checks. But security cameras would tell a different story about how random these checks really were. The footage showed the agents letting dozens of white travelers pass without approaching them. It showed them specifically focusing on people of color, particularly those who appeared to be of Latino, Middle Eastern, or African descent. It showed a clear pattern of racial profiling that had been happening for hours before Evelyn arrived. When she entered their field of vision, a middle-aged black woman traveling alone, they apparently decided she looked suspicious. Hansen signaled to his colleagues, and all 3 positioned themselves to intercept Evelyn as she walked. The cameras captured the exact moment when they blocked her path, Hansen stepping directly in front of her, forcing her to stop. Their body language was aggressive, intimidating, designed to establish dominance and control. Evelyn stopped, confusion clear on her face, waiting for them to explain why they were blocking her way. Hansen was the first to speak, and the security cameras with audio captured every word. He demanded to see her immigration documents. Evelyn, accustomed to being treated with professional respect based on her accomplishments, was caught off guard by the hostile approach. She asked why she was being stopped, what she had done that justified being approached by federal agents. Cruz responded with sarcasm, saying she knew very well why, that they weren't fools. Walsh added that if she was in the United States legally, proving it should be easy. The implication was clear. They had looked at her and assumed she didn't belong, that she must be an illegal immigrant, that she needed to prove her right to be in her own country. Evelyn, who had spent her entire career fighting exactly this kind of discriminatory treatment, felt fury rising but kept her voice calm and measured. She explained she was an American citizen, that she was returning from a business trip, and that she had no legal obligation to provide immigration documents to agents without probable cause. This response made Hansen laugh. He said something that would be quoted in dozens of news articles later. "You all say the same thing, American citizen, business trip, blah, blah, blah." Cruz added his own contribution, suggesting maybe she should have thought about her choices before jumping the border. The assumption was grotesque and based on absolutely nothing but her appearance. Here was a woman who had flown back from Washington, D.C., passed through U.S. customs without issue, was dressed professionally, and carrying clear business travel luggage. But for these agents, none of that mattered. They saw black skin and assumed illegality. Passengers started noticing the confrontation. Some people stopped to watch. Some pulled out their phones, starting to film what was happening. The airport security area was busy with hundreds of people passing through, and now several were witnessing 3 federal agents surrounding and intimidating a woman who was clearly just trying to exit the airport. Evelyn decided it was time to end this farce. She kept her voice calm, but added an authority that came from years presiding over federal court. She told the agents they were making a mistake, that she had no legal obligation to provide immigration documents without probable cause, and that they should allow her to pass immediately. Hansen interpreted this as defiance. He stepped closer, invading Evelyn's personal space in a way clearly meant to intimidate. He said if she refused to cooperate, they would have to detain her for additional verification. Cruz was already reaching for his handcuffs, assuming the threat of detention would make Evelyn comply. Walsh positioned herself behind Evelyn, effectively surrounding her completely. The security cameras captured everything from multiple angles. 3 armed federal agents in full tactical gear surrounding an unarmed middle-aged woman in casual clothes in the middle of a busy airport, for no apparent reason other than her refusal to produce papers she had no legal obligation to provide. That's when a voice cut through the tension. A man in TSA uniform, a supervisor named Robert Chen, who had been watching from the nearby security checkpoint, approached the group. He had recognized Evelyn immediately. 3 months earlier, he had appeared in federal court as a witness in a transportation security case, and Judge Morrison had presided. He remembered her because she had been exceptionally fair and professional, ensuring his testimony was heard completely despite attorneys' objections. Chen approached with an expression of complete disbelief on his face. He asked the ICE agents if they had any idea who they were approaching. Hansen told Chen to return to his post, that this wasn't TSA business. Chen ignored him completely and turned to Evelyn, addressing her as Your Honor and asking if she was okay, if she needed assistance. The expression on the 3 ICE agents' faces changed instantly from arrogant confidence to confused uncertainty. Hansen asked Chen what he meant by Your Honor. Chen, his voice now tinged with barely contained anger, explained they were harassing federal judge Evelyn Morrison of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. He emphasized each word, letting it sink in that they had just demanded immigration documents from a presidentially appointed federal judge. Blood drained from Hansen and Cruz's faces. Walsh literally took a step back, as if physical distance could somehow undo what had just happened. Hansen tried to mumble something about standard procedure, about not knowing. Evelyn cut him off. Her voice was still calm, but now carried the weight of judicial authority that had commanded respect in countless courtrooms. She said the issue wasn't that they didn't know who she was. The issue was they had looked at her, made assumptions based purely on her race, and decided she must be an illegal immigrant without a single piece of evidence to support that assumption. She pointed out she had passed through U.S. customs without issue. She was carrying clear business travel luggage. She was dressed professionally. She had calmly explained she was an American citizen, and yet they had mocked her, suggested she had jumped the border, and threatened to detain her. Evelyn asked if they had stopped any of the white travelers who had passed in the last hour. Hansen didn't respond, but his expression was answer enough. Chen added that he had been watching their random checks for almost 2 hours and that he hadn't seen them stop a single white passenger. Every person they had approached was of color. This wasn't standard procedure, it was systematic racial profiling, and they had just done it to a federal judge whose work included overseeing civil rights cases involving exactly this kind of misconduct. Passengers were now definitely paying attention. At least a dozen people were filming on their phones. Some were murmuring to each other about what they were witnessing. A man shouted that the agents should be ashamed. A woman said out loud she had seen them let her pass without questioning, despite her returning from the same flight as Evelyn. And the only difference was, she was white. Witnesses were spontaneously providing corroborating evidence of the discrimination pattern. Hansen realized the situation had become a complete public relations disaster. He tried damage control, telling Evelyn it had been a misunderstanding, that they were just doing their job. Evelyn responded that if their job was to stop American citizens based on race and demand proof of citizenship without probable cause, then they were doing work that violated the Constitution she had sworn to uphold. Chen asked Evelyn if she wanted him to call airport security or local police. Evelyn said no, it wasn't necessary. She then turned to the 3 agents and said something the security cameras captured perfectly, and that would become a viral clip shared millions of times. She said she hoped they thought about this moment every time they put on their uniforms, hoped they remembered the federal judge they assumed was an illegal immigrant because she was black, hoped it made them question every other assumption they made about people based on appearance, and hoped they understood that actions have consequences, that video of this incident would be reported to appropriate authorities, and that their superiors would be informed about how they conducted their random checks. Then she simply walked around them and continued toward the exit. Hansen called after her, saying they didn't mean to disrespect her. Evelyn stopped and turned. She said it wasn't about respecting her specifically because of her title. It was about respecting all American citizens equally, regardless of their race or appearance. She pointed out that if she weren't a federal judge, if she were a teacher or nurse or business owner or any other American citizen, the treatment she received would still be illegal and wrong. The fact it took Chen recognizing her for them to back down demonstrated exactly the problem. They shouldn't have approached her in the first place. They shouldn't be racially profiling passengers. And the fact they were doing it while wearing federal authority made it even more serious. Evelyn then asked for their names and identification numbers. Walsh hesitated. Cruz looked like he was considering refusing, but Hansen realized they had no choice. With dozens of witnesses, multiple cameras, and a federal judge making the demand, refusing would just add insubordination to their growing list of problems. Hansen provided his name and number, as did Cruz and Walsh. Evelyn noted everything on her phone, then photographed their badges to ensure she had their complete information. She said she would be filing formal complaint with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, with the Department of Homeland Security, Inspector General's office, and with the Department of Justice about systematic racial profiling at O'Hare Airport. She also said she would be requesting all security footage from the past 6 hours to document the pattern of who they stopped versus who they let pass. Hansen tried to protest, saying she was making this sound worse than it was. Evelyn asked how exactly it could be worse. They had surrounded an American citizen without probable cause, demanded immigration documents she had no obligation to provide, mocked her when she explained she was a citizen, and threatened to detain her when she refused to comply with their illegal demands, all while conducting a clear pattern of racial discrimination. She asked what part of that he thought she was exaggerating. Evelyn finally left the airport, but her mind was already working through the legal implications of what had just happened. As she drove home, she called her law clerk, Sarah Kim, and asked her to start compiling documentation. Evelyn wanted FOIA requests for all O'Hare Airport security footage from the past 6 hours, showing IICE operations. She wanted data on how many people had been stopped, disaggregated by race. She wanted training records for Hansen, Cruz, and Walsh. She wanted ICE policies on airport checks and legal authority to demand documents. Sarah, who had worked for Evelyn for 4 years and knew her well enough to recognize when she was in justice-seeking mode, said she would start immediately. She asked if Evelyn was okay. Evelyn admitted she was shocked, furious, and determined to ensure this never happened to another person at that airport. When she got home, Evelyn spent the next hour writing a detailed account of the incident while her memory was fresh. Every word, the agents said. Every action they took, the exact timeline of events, the names of potential witnesses like Robert Chen, the fact that multiple passengers had filmed. Everything was documented with the precision of someone who had spent decades preparing legal cases. Her husband, Thomas, a retired history professor, found her in the Home Office surrounded by legal notes. When she told him what had happened, he was furious. He wanted to know how federal agents could be so stupid, so blinded by prejudice that they would stop a federal judge. Evelyn pointed out that was exactly the point. They hadn't seen a federal judge. They had seen a black woman, an assumed illegal immigrant. If she hadn't been recognized by Chen, she could have been detained, taken for verification, possibly even arrested if she refused to comply with their illegal demands. The story leaked to media within 48 hours, not through Evelyn herself, but through one of the passengers who had filmed the incident. The video was posted on social media with a caption describing how 3 ICE agents had harassed a black woman at the airport only to discover she was a federal judge. The video went viral almost instantly. Within 24 hours, it had millions of views. People were shocked by the agents' arrogance, the blatant racial profiling, the way they had mocked Evelyn when she tried to explain she was a citizen. Comments were overwhelmingly supportive of Evelyn and condemning of the agents. But what really made the story explode was when national news stations picked it up and started investigating more deeply. Reporters discovered this wasn't an isolated incident. There were documented complaints about ICE operations at O'Hare Airport going back years. With multiple allegations of racial profiling and illegal detentions, ICE was forced to respond to the growing controversy. Their initial statement was weak and defensive, saying they took all allegations seriously and would conduct internal review. But the public wasn't interested in internal reviews that historically resulted in nothing. People wanted immediate action. Civil rights organizations started making statements. The ACLU issued a press release highlighting Evelyn's case as example of why immigration law enforcement needed reform and oversight. The National Association of Immigration Judges, though generally reluctant to comment on individual cases, made a rare statement expressing concern about their members being targeted for harassment while simply traveling. The American Bar Association called the incident deeply disturbing and called for full investigation. The pressure from professional and civil rights organizations was immediate and intense. Politicians started weighing in. 3 Democratic senators sent a letter to the Secretary of Homeland Security demanding explanations for how a federal judge could be racially profiled by federal agents. Illinois State Attorney General announced his office would conduct its own investigation into ICE practices at state airports. Chicago's mayor, facing his own pressure from outraged constituents, made a statement saying the city would not tolerate racial discrimination at its airports and would work with federal authorities to ensure accountability. The story dominated news cycles for days, with legal experts analyzing implications, former law enforcement weighing in on proper procedures, and civil rights advocates using the case to highlight broader systemic problems with ICE tactics. What started as a judge being stopped at an airport had transformed into a national conversation about racial profiling, federal authority, and accountability. Hansen, Cruz, and Walsh were placed on administrative leave pending investigation within 72 hours of the incident. But this time, unlike so many other misconduct cases where administrative leave was just a pause before returning to work, there was real pressure for accountability. The Department of Homeland Security. Inspector General's office opened a formal investigation. This wasn't an internal review conducted by ICE itself, but an independent investigation by an oversight body with real authority. This was rare and significant. It meant even within the federal government, people were recognizing this had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. The investigators started by reviewing the security footage Evelyn had requested through appropriate legal channels. What they found was even more damaging than Evelyn's incident alone. The cameras showed a clear pattern of discrimination over multiple hours. Hansen, Cruz, and Walsh had stopped 47 people that morning before approaching Evelyn. Of the 47, 44 were people of color. Only 3 were white, and those 3 were stopped only briefly before being released. The data was statistically impossible to explain as random. The airport had diverse traveler demographics. But ICE stops were focused almost exclusively on people of color. Investigators also discovered that, of the 44 non-white travelers stopped, 23 were American citizens who had no legal obligation to provide immigration documents but had been pressured or intimidated into doing so anyway. Several had been threatened with detention if they didn't cooperate. 2 had been actually detained briefly before being released, when their identifications were eventually verified. This entire pattern of behavior demonstrated not just that Evelyn's incident wasn't an aberration, but that it was standard operation for these agents. They routinely racially profiled travelers, exceeded their legal authority, and intimidated citizens into compliance. The fact they eventually chose the wrong target in a federal judge was just what finally brought their practices to light. Depositions began as part of the investigation. Hansen was first, and his testimony was disastrous. Under oath, he tried to defend stopping Evelyn by saying she looked suspicious. When pressed on what, specifically, looked suspicious about a middle-aged woman in business-casual clothes carrying a carry-on, he couldn't articulate anything beyond vague statements about years of experience and gut feeling. When confronted with statistics showing he had stopped almost exclusively people of color that morning, he claimed it was coincidence. When shown footage of him mocking Evelyn about jumping the border, he claimed he was trying to de-escalate through humor, which was so obviously false even his own lawyers looked embarrassed. Cruz and Walsh didn't do much better in their depositions. Neither could provide convincing legal justification for their actions. Both tried to blame Hansen as team leader, but footage showed both actively participating. The Inspector General's investigation expanded beyond just the 3 agents to examine the entire supervisory structure that had allowed this behavior to continue unchecked. They discovered that Hansen's supervisor, a 20-year ICE veteran named Richard Kowalski, had received multiple complaints about his team's racial profiling tactics over the past 18 months. None of these complaints had been properly investigated. Kowalski had consistently dismissed them as people trying to avoid legitimate immigration scrutiny without ever reviewing footage or interviewing witnesses. Internal emails revealed he had even praised Hansen in a performance review for having high stop numbers, effectively incentivizing more of the exact behavior that was now under investigation. The pattern of supervisory failures went even deeper. The ICE division responsible for airport operations had conducted minimal training on constitutional rights and authority limitations. Agents received vague guidance about being vigilant, but little specific instruction on what probable cause actually meant, or when they could legally demand documentation. Even more damaging was the discovery that ICE had been tracking stop statistics at O'Hare for years, but had never analyzed the data by race. When the Inspector General's investigators did that analysis, the results were shocking. Over a 3-year period, ICE operations at O'Hare had stopped passengers at rates that were statistically impossible to explain as random or based on legitimate suspicious behavior. Black passengers were stopped at rates 7.3 times higher than white passengers. Latino passengers were stopped at rates 8.1 times higher. Middle Eastern passengers were stopped at rates 6.8 times higher. These disparities existed even when controlling for factors like time of day, terminals, and citizenship status. The data demonstrated systematic racial profiling at an institutional scale. Evelyn's case wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom of a much larger problem that ICE had allowed, or even encouraged, through poorly conceived performance metrics that incentivized high-volume stops, without adequate oversight of how those stops were being conducted. As the federal investigation progressed, Evelyn took her own legal action. She filed a federal lawsuit not just against Hansen, Cruz, and Walsh personally, but also against ICE as an agency, the Department of Homeland Security, and several supervisors who had failed to address the documented pattern of misconduct. The lawsuit sought damages for false arrest, emotional distress, and violation of her Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure. But more important than money were the policy changes she demanded. The 94-page petition included comprehensive reforms, prohibition of stops based solely on race or appearance, requirement that agents document specific cause for each stop, mandatory training on constitutional rights and racial profiling, collection and analysis of data from all stops disaggregated by race, creation of independent oversight office to review complaints, and real consequences for agents who exceeded their authority. The lawsuit argued that without these systemic changes, ICE's discriminatory practices would continue regardless of what happened to individual agents. The federal government's response was to initially try to dismiss the case claiming sovereign immunity, arguing federal agencies couldn't be sued for their agents' actions. But Evelyn's legal team demolished this argument, citing decades of the precedent establishing that immunity doesn't apply when agents violate clearly established constitutional rights. They also pointed out the irony of a federal agency claiming immunity in a lawsuit brought by a federal judge who regularly presided over such cases and knew exactly which arguments had merit and which didn't. The judge assigned to the case, Judge Michael Torres, a colleague of Evelyn's on the federal bench, had to recuse himself due to his professional relationship with her. The case was reassigned to Judge Patricia Williams, an appointee known for being tough but fair. Williams reviewed the initial materials and denied the government's dismissal motion, ordering the case to proceed to full discovery. She noted in her decision that the allegations, if true, represented serious and systematic violations of constitutional rights that demanded full judicial scrutiny. Discovery revealed even more problems within ICE culture. Internal communications showed agents frequently making racist jokes about passengers they stopped. There was an email chain where agents shared photos of people they had detained with derogatory captions stereotyping various nationalities. Text messages between Hansen and other agents included overtly racist language discussing which passengers looked illegal based purely on physical characteristics. All this material demonstrated racial profiling. Wasn't just about statistics or bad policies. It was about personal prejudice that had been allowed to proliferate because supervisors either looked the other way or shared the same attitudes. Discovery also revealed that several passengers who had been illegally detained by these agents had tried to complain, but were told their complaints couldn't be processed because they had refused to cooperate with federal agents. It was a perfectly circular system where victims of abuse were blamed for the abuse. Public pressure on the Department of Homeland Security intensified when immigration rights organizations started gathering stories from other victims of O'Hare's practices. Dozens of people came forward sharing similar experiences of being racially profiled, aggressively interrogated, and in some cases detained despite being American citizens or legal residents. A Latino man described being stopped 5 different times over a 6-month period, always by the same agents who claimed not to remember having stopped him before. A Middle Eastern woman described being taken for secondary interrogation despite having a valid permanent resident card, where she was questioned about her religious and political views in ways that had nothing to do with immigration status. A black man who was a military veteran described being stopped in uniform with military ID and still having agents suggest his documents might be fake. Each story added another layer to the pattern of systematic misconduct the investigation was uncovering. Media continued covering the case intensively. What made it particularly compelling was the pure irony of federal agents racially profiling a federal judge whose work involved overseeing exactly these types of civil rights cases. News programs showed clips from the viral video, side by side with photos of Evelyn in her judicial robes presiding over court, highlighting the contrast between how she was treated in one context versus another. Legal. Commentators dissected the implications, noting that if this could happen to a federal judge, imagine what happened to ordinary citizens without resources or knowledge to fight back. The case became a rallying point for larger conversations about racial profiling, federal overreach, and the need for reform in immigration law enforcement agencies. Politicians who normally supported strict immigration enforcement found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to condemn what happened to Evelyn while defending ACE's authority generally. The line was getting difficult to walk. Hansen, Cruz, and Walsh faced not just professional consequences, but personal ones too. Their names were permanently associated with the case. Google searches brought up articles about how they had racially profiled a federal judge. Their families faced scrutiny and community shame. Walsh's teenage daughter was confronted at school about her mother's actions. Cruz's brother, who worked in immigrant rights advocacy, publicly distanced himself from him. Hansen's wife filed for divorce, citing among other reasons the public exposure and stress from the case. The personal consequences were severe, and some argued disproportionate for what had technically been just doing their job badly. But Evelyn and her supporters pointed out that when you have power to detain people, to potentially ruin their lives through deportation or criminal charges, and you abuse that power through racial discrimination, severe consequences are appropriate. This wasn't about destroying individual lives for sport. It was about establishing that actions have consequences, especially when those actions violate citizens' constitutional rights. 12 months after the airport incident, the Department of Justice made an extraordinary settlement offer that surprised even experienced legal observers. The offer included $4.7 million in direct compensation to Evelyn, but that was just the beginning. The federal government was agreeing to implement comprehensive reforms in ICE airport operations across the country, not just at O'Hare. Every ICE agent assigned to airport work would be required to complete 80 hours of intensive training on constitutional rights, with specific focus on the Fourth Amendment and prohibition on racial profiling. The training would include modules developed in consultation with civil rights organizations and would be conducted by outside instructors, not ICE personnel. Agents would have to pass competency tests demonstrating understanding of when they could and couldn't legally detain or interrogate passengers. Failing the test would result in removal from airport duties until successful retraining was completed. More significant were the accountability requirements. Every airport where ICE operated would have to install security cameras covering all areas where agents interacted with passengers. Footage would have to be retained for a minimum of 2 years and be available for review by an independent oversight office. ICE would be required to collect detailed data on every stop: passenger's race, specific reason for stop, duration of detention, outcome, and whether documents were requested. This data would have to be publicly reported quarterly, disaggregated by race, airport, and individual agent. Statistical analysis would be conducted to identify patterns of racial profiling, and any agent whose numbers showed statistically significant disparity would be subject to automatic review. The settlement created an ICE Civil Rights Oversight Office separate from the agency's normal chain of command, staffed with independent investigators with authority to investigate complaints, review operations, and recommend discipline, including termination. The consequences for Hansen, Cruz, and Walsh were explicitly specified in the settlement. All three would be permanently fired from ICE, with revocation of their federal law enforcement certifications. They would be barred from working in any law enforcement capacity at federal, state, or local level anywhere in the United States. Their names would be added to a national database of law enforcement officers terminated for misconduct, making it virtually impossible to get similar work in any jurisdiction. Supervisor Kowalski, who had failed to address complaints about his team, would be demoted and transferred to a non-supervisory position. He would have to undergo extensive retraining and be subject to intensified performance review for the next 3 years. If any new complaints arose during that period, he would be terminated. The settlement recognized that individual accountability was important, but insufficient. That real change required reforming the systems that had allowed misconduct to flourish. Evelyn spent weeks considering whether to accept the settlement. It was more comprehensive than she had hoped, particularly the systemic reforms. But part of her wanted to go to trial, wanted to force the government to publicly defend its agents' actions in open court. She knew the evidence was overwhelming, that videos and statistical data would make victory almost certain. A trial would create even stronger legal precedent and generate sustained media attention that could drive reforms beyond what the settlement guaranteed. But it would also mean additional years of her life consumed by the case. It would mean depositions and cross-examinations and repeatedly reliving the humiliation of being racially profiled. Thomas, her husband, reminded her she had proven her point, that the reforms in the settlement were substantive and binding, and that she could use the financial compensation to create change through other means. After consulting with civil rights organizations that had supported her case, Evelyn decided to accept the settlement. Not because it was easier, but because it achieved her primary goal of forcing systemic change. The press conference announcing the settlement attracted national and international media. Evelyn, wearing professional attire but not her judicial robes, stood at a podium in downtown Chicago reading a carefully prepared statement. She described what had happened that day at O'Hare Airport not with anger, but but with factual clarity. She explained she had served on the federal bench for 8 years, dedicating her career to protecting constitutional rights and ensuring equal justice under law. She said that February day she had experienced exactly the kind of racial profiling and abuse of authority she had spent her career fighting, but she also emphasized she wasn't speaking just as a judge or as an individual who had been wronged. She was speaking for all American citizens, particularly people of color, who faced racial profiling routinely, but didn't have resources or platform to fight back. The settlement she had reached would create protections and accountability that would benefit everyone, not just those with titles or connections. Evelyn acknowledged the civil rights organizations that had supported her case, witnesses like Robert Chen, who had come forward, and passengers who had filmed crucial evidence. She particularly thanked ordinary citizens who had shared their own stories of being racially profiled, even when it required reliving trauma and risking unwanted attention. Their voices had been essential in demonstrating this wasn't about an isolated incident, but a systemic problem. She spoke directly about race, refusing to soften the reality of what had happened. The agents had looked at her and seen a black woman, and that single observation had triggered a series of assumptions that led them to violate her constitutional rights. This same dynamic happened countless times every day with people who never made the news, never received justice, never saw perpetrators face consequences. The settlement wouldn't end racial profiling, but it would create tools to identify it, accountability to punish it, and deterrence to prevent it. Reporters asked questions after the statement. Someone asked if she thought $4.7 million compensation was enough. Evelyn responded that no amount of money could undo the humiliation of being surrounded by armed federal agents in a busy airport, of having her citizenship questioned, of being mocked when she tried to explain who she was. But the money would allow her to create lasting change. She announced she was establishing the Justice in Travel Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to monitoring law enforcement practices at airports, providing legal assistance to travelers whose rights were violated, and advocating for policy reforms. The foundation would use data published under the settlement to identify ongoing discrimination patterns and hold airports accountable. It would work with affected communities to educate them about their rights and how to document violations. It would provide free legal representation for people who experienced similar treatment but couldn't afford lawyers. The goal wasn't just to win one lawsuit, but to create systemic change that would outlast any individual case. Another reporter asked how she felt about Hansen, Cruz, and Walsh losing their careers permanently. Evelyn paused before responding, choosing her words carefully. She said she took no pleasure in anyone's suffering, but that consequences were necessary when people with power abused it. These agents had had authority to detain people, to potentially ruin them through deportation or criminal charges. They had exercised that authority discriminatorily, targeting people based on race rather than behavior or evidence. They had done this not once but repeatedly as a pattern of operation. And when confronted about their behavior, they had doubled down rather than acknowledge error. People in positions of public trust who violate that trust through discrimination don't deserve to continue in those positions. This wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring they couldn't continue harming others. She expressed hope they would use this experience for reflection and personal growth, to confront their own prejudices and become better people. But that would have to happen outside of law enforcement. The settlements were signed, reforms implemented, and agents fired. But for Evelyn, the real work was just beginning. The Justice in Travel Foundation she established with part of her settlement, compensation became one of the most effective civil rights oversight organizations in the country. In the first 3 years, the foundation monitored reform implementation at 47 major airports where ICE operated, reviewing quarterly data, investigating complaints, and holding agencies accountable when numbers showed continued disparity patterns. The transparent data publication the settlement mandated proved to be a powerful tool. When Miami Airport showed Latino passenger stops at rates 6.2 times higher than whites after reform implementation, Evelyn's foundation immediately flagged it and worked with local media to bring attention. The resulting public pressure forced complete review of Miami operations and retraining of all ICE staff there. Accountability worked when it was public and data-driven. The foundation also provided direct legal representation for 89 travelers in its first 3 years who experienced racial profiling or illegal detention at airports. Many of these cases resulted in smaller settlements that not only compensated individuals, but created policy changes at specific airports. The foundation developed a mobile app, allowing travelers to easily document encounters with law enforcement agents, including recording audio and video, logging agent names and badges, and instantly submitting reports for foundation review. The app was downloaded over 200,000 times and generated hundreds of reports documenting both misconduct and, positively, examples of agents conducting themselves appropriately. The data helped identify best practices that could be replicated and problematic patterns that needed to be addressed. It transformed travelers from passive victims into active participants in law enforcement oversight. Hansen, Cruz, and Walsh disappeared from public life after their terminations. Hansen tried to get work in corporate security, but found employers reluctant to hire someone whose name was permanently associated with racially profiling a federal judge. He eventually ended up working in a warehouse for a fraction of his previous salary. Cruz moved to another state and worked construction, cutting ties with many friends and family who felt shame about his actions. Walsh tried to appeal her termination through civil lawsuit, claiming she was just following Hansen's orders, but the case was dismissed when footage clearly showed her active and enthusiastic participation. She lost her home due to legal costs and ended up living with relatives. Some felt these consequences too severe, arguing one mistake shouldn't destroy lives completely, but others, including Evelyn, pointed out this wasn't a mistake, but a conscious choice to discriminate based on race, repeatedly, despite training and policies saying not to. Authority comes with responsibility, and abusing that authority through discrimination deserves serious consequences. The broader impact of Evelyn's case extended far beyond airport reforms. The case became one of the most cited in jurisprudence on racial profiling and federal authority limitations. It was taught in law schools as example of how video evidence and statistical data can prove discrimination. Law enforcement training schools used videos from the incident as teaching tools about what not to do. The case influenced legislation in 7 states, creating data collection requirements and accountability mechanisms for immigration law enforcement operations. It inspired similar lawsuits at other airports where travelers documented racial profiling, creating a wave of accountability that forced systemic changes. And it provided a model for how individuals with resources and platform could use their experiences of injustice to create change benefiting those without such advantages. Evelyn continued. Serving on the federal bench, her reputation strengthened rather than hurt by the controversy. She was recognized nationally not just as an exceptional magistrate, but as someone who had demonstrated courage in confronting injustice even when she was the victim. 5 years after the incident, she was appointed to the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, a promotion to one of the most prestigious judicial positions in the country. During her Senate confirmation hearing, multiple senators from both parties mentioned the airport incident, with some praising how she had transformed personal experience of discrimination into systemic change, while others expressed discomfort about a judge suing a federal agency. But her confirmation was approved with comfortable margin, recognizing her qualifications and integrity. In her swearing-in speech, Evelyn spoke briefly about the airport incident, saying it had given her perspective on why the work of protecting constitutional rights mattered so much, why vigilance against discrimination could never relax. Robert Chen, the TSA supervisor who had recognized Evelyn and intervened that day, became a close friend. They occasionally appeared together at events speaking about the importance of witnesses taking action when they saw injustice. Chen always emphasized he did nothing heroic. He simply spoke up when he saw something wrong. But Evelyn pointed out that in a world where many people choose not to get involved, simply speaking up requires courage. Chen eventually left TSA to work for Evelyn's foundation as Director of Community Outreach, using his experience in transportation security to help develop training programs. Their friendship demonstrated how connections could form through shared adversity, how people from different backgrounds could find common ground in commitment to justice. Data continued revealing progress and challenges. 5 years after reform implementation, racial disparities in airport stops had decreased, significantly but not disappeared. Black passengers were still stopped at rates 2.1 times higher than whites. down from 7.3 before reforms, but still indicating ongoing bias. Some airports showed dramatic improvements, while others showed little progress. The variation suggested culture change required more than just new policies. It required leadership committed to implementation and ongoing oversight to ensure accountability. Evelyn's foundation used data to identify best-performing airports and study what they were doing differently, then advocated replicating those practices nationally. Progress was incremental but real, lives being positively impacted by reforms that never would have happened without Evelyn's case forcing the issue. Reflecting 10 years after the incident, Evelyn said in an interview she would never wish to relive that day at O'Hare Airport. The humiliation of being surrounded by armed agents, of having her citizenship questioned, of being treated as suspect in her own country based purely on her skin, left scars that never completely healed. But she transformed that trauma into purpose, used her platform to amplify voices of countless others who experienced similar discrimination without resources to fight back, created accountability systems that made it harder for agents to discriminate without consequences, demonstrated that systemic change was possible when evidence was documented, when victims refused to stay silent, when allies took action. Her story wasn't just about a judge being racially profiled. It was about transforming personal injustice into collective justice, about using privilege and position to benefit those without such advantages, about refusing to accept that this is how things are and insisting things could be better. Sometimes justice prevails, and when it prevails, it should be documented, celebrated, and used as foundation to ensure it prevails more often for more people.